The alarm on my ship screamed before I even opened my eyes. I was Veteran Kal, a commander of the Sondrel fleet, and in 300 years of service, no alarm had ever sounded like that one. Not urgent, not tactical. It sounded afraid. I rose from my rest chamber and moved to the command deck, my claws clicking against the metal floor in a rhythm I had known since I was young. My crew stood frozen at their stations, staring at a screen that showed nothing but static and a single flashing word: unknown. "Report," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. "Commander, the scout ship Andras has stopped transmitting," said Tulik, my second in command. Its last message was cut off mid-sentence. I frowned. Scout ships did not simply stop. They were built to survive, built to run, built to report even while dying. I had seen a scout ship broadcast its own destruction in perfect detail once, calm and clear, right up until the connection ended. This was different. This was silence, where there should have been noise. Where was it stationed? The edge of a system called Sol, Commander. Third planet. The inhabitants call themselves humans. I had heard the name before, in passing, the way one hears the name of an insect before stepping on it. A young species, no psionic ability, no natural armor, short lives, soft bodies, primitive weapons compared to ours. My superiors had laughed about them during a briefing weeks earlier, calling them an afternoon's work, a formality, before we moved on to worlds that actually mattered. I did not laugh now. "Send another scout," I ordered, "and prepare the fleet for a full pacification approach. If the humans destroyed one of our ships, they will learn quickly what that mistake costs them." Tulik hesitated, which was unlike him. In 3 centuries of fighting beside him, I had never seen Tulik hesitate before a battle. "Commander," he said slowly, "the wreckage of the Andras was found. It was not destroyed by weapons fire." "Then how?" "There is no clear answer yet. The hull shows no burns, no impacts, no signs of conflict. It simply stopped, as if something reached inside it and turned it off." A cold feeling moved through me, one I did not have a word for yet. I would learn the word soon enough, though it would not come from my own language. It would come from the humans themselves, translated imperfectly into something my mind could barely hold. Dread. But that word meant nothing to me in that moment. In that moment, I only felt confusion, and confusion was something my species did not tolerate well. We were the Sondrel. Across 40 conquered worlds, our name alone was enough to bring cities to their knees. Fleets surrendered before we fired a single shot. Governments dissolved themselves, rather than face our ships in orbit. Fear was not just a tool for us. It was a proven weapon, tested across centuries, refined into something as reliable as gravity. I told myself the humans would be no different. I told myself the silence from the scout ship was a malfunction, nothing more, and that once our fleet arrived in their system, the same old pattern would repeat itself. We would descend. We would show force. They would surrender. It always worked this way. I ordered the fleet forward. As we crossed the outer edge of their system, I studied what little information we had gathered. Sol had 8 planets, though only the third seemed to interest us, a blue and green world, called Earth by its inhabitants. Their technology was advanced enough to leave their planet but not advanced enough, by any calculation my analysts could produce, to threaten a fleet like ours. Their weapons were built from metal and fire, nothing like the energy systems that powered our own arsenal. Their ships were slow. Their numbers were unremarkable. By every measure that had ever mattered before, humans should have been nothing. And yet, I stood at the viewport as our fleet slid into position above their moon, far enough to remain hidden from casual observation, but close enough to strike within moments. My analysts had prepared the usual opening move, the one that had worked on world after world. We would destroy an unpopulated structure, something symbolic, loud enough to be seen from their capital cities, and then broadcast a message demanding surrender before their leaders even had time to gather their thoughts. It was clean. It was efficient. It had never failed. "Transmit the demonstration order," I said. Tulik's claws moved over his console, and a moment later, one of their orbital stations, empty of any human life according to our scans, was struck by a precision beam from one of our support vessels. The station broke apart silently in the vacuum, debris spinning outward in slow, lazy arcs. I watched their planet for a response. In every previous first contact, This was the moment fear took hold. Communications would spike as terrified leaders scrambled to respond. Military networks would go dark as commanders realized resistance was pointless. Within minutes, someone would reach out, voice shaking, and offer whatever we wanted, in exchange for their lives. The humans did not do this. Instead, their planetary defense network came alive all at once, a coordinated response so fast that my sensor operators initially assumed it was some kind of automated system rather than a living decision made by living minds. Ships rose from hidden bases. Signals I did not recognize crossed their communication channels, sharp and clipped, nothing like the panicked chatter I expected. "Commander," said my sensor officer, a young Sondrel named Ashvin, "they are not retreating. They are advancing toward our position." I did not understand. No species advanced toward a fleet like ours after a demonstration of our power. It violated everything I had learned about how fear worked, how it was supposed to work, how it had always worked. "Confirm the order," I said. "Perhaps there is an error." "There is no error, Commander. Human vessels are moving to intercept." I gave the order to engage, expecting the encounter to be brief. Our shields alone were rated to withstand weapons far more advanced than anything their scans suggested humans possessed. I expected their ships to be destroyed within moments. Another lesson delivered. Another world humbled. The battle that followed was unlike anything in 300 years of my service. Their ships were smaller than ours, faster than our models had predicted, and their pilots flew with a kind of aggression I had never encountered. They did not maintain safe distances. They did not retreat when damaged. One human vessel, its hull already breached and venting atmosphere, continued firing until the very last moment before it went dark. Another ship, faced with certain destruction, altered its course and collided directly into one of our support vessels, destroying both in a single burst of light. I stood on my command deck and felt something shift inside me, something I did not have a name for. "Casualties," I said quietly. "3 support vessels destroyed, Commander. 2 more damaged." 3 centuries of service, and I had never lost 3 ships in a single opening engagement against a species with no history of interstellar war. I looked at the tactical display, at the small, stubborn cluster of human vessels still holding their position, despite being outnumbered and outgunned by every measure our systems could calculate. "Order a full retreat to the outer system," I said. "We will reassess." Tulik looked at me, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something in his eyes that mirrored what I felt inside my own chest. Not fear of the humans' weapons, something else. Something that had no place in 300 years of victories. We withdrew to the edge of their system, and I sat alone in my quarters that night, replaying the battle in my mind, trying to understand what I had witnessed. Every species I had ever encountered understood the language of overwhelming force. They understood that survival meant yielding to something greater. It was the most basic law of existence, one written into the behavior of every living thing I had ever studied. The humans had broken that law without hesitation, without visible struggle, as though it had never applied to them in the first place. I did not sleep that night. I stared instead at the image of their planet on my view screen, a small blue world spinning quietly beneath us, entirely unaware of how completely it had already begun to unravel everything I understood about power, about fear, and about what it meant to be the strongest thing in the room. Somewhere down there, among billions of soft, short-lived, poorly armored creatures, something was different. Something that did not run, something that did not bow. And though I did not yet have the word for it, I could feel it already beginning to take root inside me, quiet and patient, waiting for the moment it would fully bloom. Dread. 3 days passed before I called a council with my senior officers. In that time, my analysts had reviewed every scrap of footage from the battle, searching for the flaw in our approach, the mistake that had cost us 3 ships, and forced a retreat no Sondrel fleet had needed in living memory. I wanted answers before I reported anything to the Directorate. I did not yet know how to explain what I had seen, and I feared, correctly as it turned out, that no one back home would believe me without proof. Tulik stood beside me as the officers gathered in the strategy chamber, a wide circular room, lined with screens, showing every angle of the failed engagement. Ashvin, my sensor officer, looked exhausted, his eyes dimmed from 3 sleepless nights spent combing through data. "Show me everything," I said, "from the beginning." The screens lit up with the recorded battle, replayed in careful detail. I watched again as our demonstration strike destroyed the empty station. Watched the human defense network spring to life within seconds rather than minutes. Watched their ships close the distance instead of retreating to safety. Pause here, I said. At the moment their first vessel made contact with ours. Analysis? Ashvin stepped forward, his voice careful. Commander, their ship should have altered course. Every model we possess indicates that no crewed vessel intentionally destroys itself when other options remain. Yet this pilot chose collision over retreat, despite having sufficient time and thruster capacity to disengage. Do we know why? We do not, Commander. Not yet. I turned to Tulek. Bring me a name. Anything the humans call themselves. I want to speak to one of them directly. Not through data, not through wreckage. I want to understand what we are facing. It took another 2 days for my intelligence officers to intercept and locate a prisoner from their forces. A single human pilot had ejected from a damaged fighter during the battle and drifted for hours before one of our recovery drones located the pod and brought it aboard. The pilot survived the recovery, which surprised my medical staff more than it should have, given how fragile human bodies were described in every report I had read. I ordered the prisoner brought before me. Her name, according to the translation devices, was Grace Whitfield. She was young by human standards, though I had little context for what that truly meant. Her hair was the color of dark soil, and her eyes, when she looked at me, held none of the wide-eyed terror I expected from a captured enemy standing before a commander of the Sondrel fleet. She looked, instead, mildly curious. You understand our language now, I said, through the translator fitted to my collar. I have questions. I figured you might, she said. Her voice was steady, almost casual, as though she were speaking to a colleague, rather than the commander of the fleet that had just tried to conquer her world. Your pilot destroyed himself rather than retreat, I said. Why? Grace tilted her head slightly, as if the question surprised her. Which one? The one who collided with our support vessel. Oh, that was probably Daniel. Or Oliver. Hard to say without seeing the footage. She said this without any visible grief, and I found myself studying her expression closely, searching for the sorrow I expected to find hidden beneath her calm. You do not mourn him. I didn't say that, she replied. I just don't know which one it was. And even if I did, that's not really your business, is it? I felt something unfamiliar stir in my chest, something between frustration and unease. Every prisoner I had ever questioned across 3 centuries eventually broke, eventually pleaded, eventually offered information in exchange for mercy. Grace Whitfield sat across from me with her hands folded, her posture relaxed, and answered my questions as though she held all the power in the room, rather than none of it. Do you understand your situation? I asked. Your world has no defense against a fleet like mine. I could destroy your cities from orbit within hours. Your species will not survive contact with us, unless you surrender. You already tried the whole scary demonstration thing, Grace said. How did that work out for you? I did not answer immediately. The question landed with more weight than I expected, and I realized, with some discomfort, that I had no response that did not sound like an admission of failure. Your species does not understand what you are dealing with, I said instead. We have conquered 40 worlds. Every one of them understood the wisdom of surrender before further destruction became necessary. 40 worlds, Grace repeated, as though tasting the number. That is a lot. Guess you have never lost then. No, I said. We have not. Well, she said, leaning back slightly in her restraints, there is a first time for everything. I ordered her returned to her holding cell and left the interrogation chamber more unsettled than I had entered it. I had expected fear, or defiance born from fear, the kind I had seen in 100 captured leaders across 100 conquered worlds. What I found instead was something closer to indifference, as though the threat of annihilation simply did not register with her the way it should have. I reviewed the recording of our conversation many times that night, searching for the crack beneath her composure, the tremor in her voice, anything that would confirm she was simply hiding her fear rather than lacking it entirely. I found nothing. Either Grace Whitfield was the single most disciplined prisoner I had ever encountered, or humans experienced fear differently than every other species we had ever catalogued. I did not yet understand that both possibilities were, in their own way, true. The following week, I ordered a second and larger engagement, this time with a full pacification fleet rather than a demonstration force. My superiors in the Directorate had grown impatient with my caution, and I understood their frustration, even as I harbored growing doubts about the wisdom of the approach. 40 worlds had fallen to strength in numbers. I told myself the humans would fall the same way, given sufficient force. We struck a coastal city under cover of their planet's night cycle, targeting infrastructure rather than population, following the same doctrine that had worked so many times before: fear, then surrender, then control. It was a formula older than my own service record. The humans did not surrender. Instead, within hours, coordinated strikes hit 3 of our orbital support stations, launched from mobile platforms our scans had failed to detect. Hidden beneath their oceans and inside mountain ranges, our sensors had dismissed as geologically unremarkable. My analysts later determined the humans had been preparing these defenses for years, long before we had ever entered their system, as though they had anticipated an invasion from the stars before they even possessed the technology to leave their own world. They knew we were coming, Tuluk said quietly, as we reviewed the aftermath. Long before we arrived. That is not possible, I said, though even as I spoke the words I doubted them. Commander, consider their history, Ashvin offered, stepping forward with a datapad trembling slightly in his grip. Our researchers have been studying their recorded culture. Humans have imagined invasion from beyond their world for centuries before it happened. Stories, performances, warnings passed down through generations. They built their defenses, not because they knew of us specifically, but because they always assumed something like us might come. I sat with that information for a long moment, feeling its weight settle over me like a fog rolling across open ground. Every other species we had ever encountered had built their civilizations around the assumption of safety, the belief that the universe, left alone, would leave them alone in return. Humans, it seemed, had built their entire history around the opposite assumption. They had prepared, quietly and constantly, for exactly the kind of arrival we represented, never certain it would happen, but never willing to be caught unready if it did. We were not fighting a species discovering fear for the first time. We were fighting a species that had spent its entire existence rehearsing for us. I called for a full withdrawal to the outer system once more, against the protests of officers who still believed overwhelming force would eventually break the humans, as it had broken every other world. I did not share their confidence. Something had changed in me since my conversation with Grace Whitfield, something I could not yet name, though I felt its presence growing heavier with each passing day. That night, alone in my quarters, I reviewed the recording of her voice one final time. There is a first time for everything, she had said, calm as still water, as though the fate of her entire planet meant no more to her than a passing inconvenience. I did not sleep. I stared instead at the tactical display, watching the small blue world continue its slow, unbothered rotation beneath us, and I began, for the first time in 300 years of service, to seriously consider the possibility that my fleet might not win. It was not fear that kept me awake. It was the growing, formless certainty that whatever we were dealing with, it did not run on the same rules as everything I had ever conquered before, and I no longer knew how to predict what would happen next. The Directorate summoned me to answer for the withdrawal, and I stood before the Council of High Commanders through a long-range transmission, my image projected across a chamber I had not seen in person for over a decade. They wanted numbers. They wanted explanations. They wanted, above all, reassurance that the Sondrel fleet still held the advantage over a species with no history of interstellar conflict. I gave them the numbers. I did not give them reassurance, because I no longer had any to offer. "Commander Call," said High Commander Yereth, her voice carrying the practiced calm of someone who had never personally faced what I had faced. "You report the loss of 6 vessels against a pre-industrial species, with no known allies, and no experience beyond their own solar system. Explain this failure in terms the Council can accept." "There is no explanation that will satisfy the Council," I said, "because the Council has not seen what my crew has seen." "Then show us." I transmitted the recordings, all of them, the destroyed station, the human pilot's collision, the hidden defense platforms rising from beneath their oceans, and finally, the recording of my conversation with Grace Whitfield. I watched the faces of the High Commanders as they viewed the footage, Watch their practiced calm falter in small, telling ways. A narrowed eye here, a stiffened posture there. When the recordings ended, the chamber was silent for longer than protocol allowed. "She shows no fear," Yareth finally said, studying the frozen image of Grace's calm expression. "Is this typical of the species?" "I do not yet know what is typical for them," I admitted. "I only know that nothing about their behavior matches any pattern in our archives. 40 conquered worlds, and I have never encountered anything like this." "Then you will study them further," Yareth said, "and you will find their weakness. Every species has one. You will find it, and you will bring us their surrender within the cycle." I returned to my fleet with new orders, and an old, familiar doubt settling deeper into my chest with each passing hour. Over the following weeks, we conducted careful surveillance rather than direct assault, gathering as much information as we could about the humans without engaging their defenses again. What we learned only deepened the unease that had taken root in me since my first conversation with Grace. Humans did not fight only with weapons, they fought with everything. Their engineers repaired damaged infrastructure within days rather than the months our models predicted. Their leaders, when we intercepted their broadcasts, spoke to their people not with pleas for calm, but with something closer to grim humor, joking about the invasion, as though it were an unwelcome storm rather than an existential threat. Their soldiers, when interviewed by their own journalists, described the encounter with an odd mixture of seriousness and something I struggled to categorize, something almost like anticipation. One broadcast in particular stayed with me. A young human officer, a man named Ethan Marlowe according to the translation, spoke to a gathered crowd in what appeared to be a public square. I had my linguists translate his words in full, expecting propaganda, expecting fear disguised as courage. "They came here thinking we'd fold," Ethan said, his voice carrying easily across the crowd. "They came here with ships bigger than anything we've built, and they thought that would be enough. Maybe it would have been enough anywhere else, but it isn't enough here. Because we've always known something like this might happen. We've been telling each other stories about it for 100 years, and every single time, in every single story, we found a way through. So let them come. We'll figure this out the way we figure everything out. Together, and stubborn, and not particularly polite about it." The crowd laughed at the last part, an actual laugh, warm and unafraid, in the middle of what should have been the darkest moment in their species' history. I watched that recording more times than I would admit to my crew. It was during this period of careful observation that I first began to hear my own soldiers speak of something troubling. Tulik reported that several members of our boarding teams, veterans of multiple successful campaigns, had requested reassignment away from the human front. I summoned 2 of them personally, expecting complaints about the harsh conditions or the unpredictable tactics. What I received instead was harder to dismiss. "Commander," said one of them, a soldier named Vesic who had served under me for over 80 years, "I do not fear their weapons. I fear what happens after. I keep replaying the recordings. I keep hearing that officer's voice. I do not sleep well anymore, Commander, and I do not know why." "Explain further," I said. Vesic struggled with the words, his usually steady voice faltering. "Every world we have conquered, Commander, feared us in a way I understood. It made sense. It felt correct, the way the universe should work. The humans do not fear us that way, and something about their calm has begun to feel wrong to me, deep in a place I cannot easily reach. I find myself doubting things I have never doubted before. I find myself wondering if we are the ones who should be afraid." I dismissed him with orders for rest, though I suspected, correctly, that rest would not solve what troubled him. I had begun to feel the same erosion in myself, a slow crumbling of certainties I had carried since before Vesic was even born. It was around this time that I requested a second meeting with Grace Whitfield, hoping to better understand the source of this creeping unease. She had been held in reasonably comfortable quarters aboard my vessel, treated according to the protocols for high-value prisoners, and she greeted my arrival with the same mild curiosity she had shown during our first conversation. "Back again," she said. "Miss me?" "I want to understand something," I said, ignoring the strange informality of her tone. "My soldiers describe a feeling they cannot name when they study your species, a discomfort that grows the longer they observe you. I want to know if this is intentional. Some form of psychological technique." Grace considered this for a long moment, and for the first time, I saw something shift behind her eyes, something more thoughtful than the casual defiance she had shown before. "I don't think it's a technique," she said slowly. "I think it's just us. You're used to species that get scared and back down. We get scared too, don't get me wrong. Everybody down there is terrified, if you want the honest truth. But being scared doesn't mean stopping. It never has, for us. We just keep going anyway. And I think that's the part your people can't wrap their heads around. You've built your whole existence around fear working the way it's supposed to work, and we broke that rule without even trying very hard." "What do you call this feeling then?" I asked. "The thing my soldiers experience when they realize your fear does not stop you?" Grace thought about this for a moment, and when she answered, her voice had lost its earlier lightness, replaced by something quieter, almost gentle. "I think you're describing dread," she said. "Fear is when you're scared of something you understand. Dread is when you're scared of something you don't understand at all, something that keeps happening no matter what you do to stop it. Fear has an edge to it, a shape. Dread doesn't have an edge. It just sits there, growing, and you can't ever quite get rid of it." I sat with that word for a long time after leaving her cell. Dread. It fit, in a way that unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. My soldiers were not afraid of human weapons. Our shields and our numbers still gave us an advantage in any single engagement, when measured purely by force. What they feared, what I feared, was the growing certainty that no amount of force would ever produce the result we expected. Every other species had eventually understood that resistance against overwhelming power was pointless. Humans seemed constitutionally incapable of reaching that understanding, no matter how much power we displayed. Weeks passed, and the pattern repeated itself with increasing consequences. We launched a third engagement, larger than the previous two combined, targeting a major human settlement with a full assault force rather than a limited strike. I told myself this time would be different, that overwhelming numbers would finally produce the surrender that had eluded us twice before. The humans met us with everything they had, and more than we expected. Civilian vessels, repurposed with makeshift weapons, joined the battle alongside their military forces. Ground defenses I had not detected during our surveillance opened fire the moment our landing craft descended. And in the middle of the chaos, human soldiers on the ground fought with a ferocity that defied every model my analysts had constructed, holding positions long after their command structures had been disrupted, continuing to resist, even when isolated from any hope of reinforcement. I received a report midway through the battle that shook me more than any casualty figure could have. A small group of human soldiers, cut off and surrounded, had been given the opportunity to surrender by one of our ground commanders, an offer of mercy in exchange for laying down their weapons. Their response, translated and relayed to me in real time, was not a plea for their lives, nor a desperate final stand born of despair. It was laughter. One of the soldiers, according to the recording, had said something to the effect of, "You really thought that would work?" Before the group launched a final, coordinated assault against overwhelming odds, an assault that ultimately failed to save them, but succeeded in destroying two of our advanced units, and delaying our forces long enough for reinforcements to arrive, and turn the tide of the entire engagement. I stood on my command deck that night, and stared at the tactical display long after the battle had ended, long after Tulik and the rest of my senior officers had retired to their quarters. The human settlement we had targeted remained standing, damaged but defiant, and our fleet had withdrawn once again, having failed for a third time to achieve the surrender that should have come easily against a species so far behind us in every measurable way. I thought of Grace Whitfield's words, turning them over in my mind, like a stone worn smooth by water. Dread doesn't have an edge. It just sits there, growing, and you can't ever quite get rid of it. I understood, finally and fully, that we were no longer fighting a war we could win through the methods that had built our empire. We were fighting something that did not respond to the rules the universe had always followed, at least in every corner of it we had ever explored before finding this small, stubborn blue world and the strange, unbreakable creatures who called it home. And somewhere deep inside myself, in the same place Vesic had described, I felt the last of my old certainty finally give way. I stopped sleeping the way I once did. It began as small things, a restlessness in the hours before my scheduled rest, a tendency to review recordings of the battles long after they had ended, searching for something I could not name. Within a month, I understood this was not a passing condition. It had settled into me the way a season settles into a landscape, quiet and complete, changing everything beneath its surface. I was not alone. Tulek came to me one evening, his usually composed demeanor frayed at the edges, in a way I had never witnessed in the decades we had served together. He requested a private audience, which was unusual enough on its own that I cleared my schedule immediately. "Commander," he said, once the chamber door had sealed behind him, "I need to speak with you about something I am not proud to admit." "Speak freely," I said. "You have earned that much." He hesitated, his claws opening and closing slowly at his sides. "I have begun to have difficulty commanding the boarding teams, not because I doubt their loyalty, or my own capability. It is something else. Every time I prepare an assault plan against human positions, I find myself imagining their response before it happens, and my imagination is never wrong. I picture the counterattack they will launch, the sacrifice they will make, the strange calm they will show in the face of it, and I am correct every single time. I have begun to feel as though I know them better than I know my own people, and that knowledge terrifies me more than any weapon they possess." I understood exactly what he described, because I had felt the same creeping familiarity settle over my own thoughts. "You are not alone in this," I told him. "I have heard similar reports from a dozen officers across the fleet, soldiers requesting transfer, analysts refusing further assignment to human data. Even our medical staff report an increase in fatigue and disturbed rest among the crew, conditions with no clear physical cause." "What is happening to us, Commander?" I thought of Grace Whitfield's word, the one she had offered so calmly during our second conversation, and I found myself speaking it aloud for the first time to another member of my own species. "Dread," I said, "I believe we are experiencing something the humans have a specific word for, a condition distinct from ordinary fear. Fear passes once the danger is understood and addressed. This does not pass. It grows. The longer we study them, the longer we fight them, the longer we fail to produce the outcome every instinct tells us should be inevitable." Tulek considered this for a long moment. "Is there a cure for it?" "I do not know," I admitted. "I am not certain the humans have found one either. Perhaps it is simply the price of understanding them at all." Word of our repeated failures had, by this point, reached beyond the Directorate and into the wider Sondrel public, despite efforts to control the flow of information. I received increasingly urgent communications, demanding results, demanding explanations, demanding the swift and total conquest that had defined our reputation across 40 worlds. I no longer knew how to give them what they wanted, and I had begun to suspect that no commander could. I requested, and eventually received, permission to attempt a different approach, one built not on overwhelming force, but on limited, careful engagement, designed to gather understanding rather than territory. My superiors approved this shift reluctantly, more out of desperation than confidence, having exhausted their patience with direct assault after 3 costly failures. It was during this period that I visited Grace Whitfield for what would become our final conversation before her eventual release, a decision my superiors would question, but which I stood behind fully, then and afterward. She looked different when I entered her holding chamber that day, not afraid, never afraid, but perhaps a little tired, the way anyone grows tired after enough time spent away from everything familiar. "You look worse than the last time I saw you," she observed, studying my posture with an attentiveness I had not expected from a prisoner. "I have not been sleeping well," I admitted, surprising myself with the honesty of the statement. "Dread will do that," she said simply, as though this were the most obvious thing in the world. "I want to understand something," I said, settling into the chair across from her restraints. "Your species is soft. Your bodies break easily. Your lives are short compared to mine. By every measure my people have ever used to predict outcomes, you should have surrendered after our first demonstration of force. Why didn't you?" Grace was quiet for a while before answering, and when she did, her voice carried a weight I had not heard from her before. "I think," she said slowly, "it's because we've never had the luxury of assuming things would be fine. Our whole history is full of things trying to wipe us out. Diseases, disasters, each other, more often than I'd like to admit. We never got the easy version of existence where the universe just leaves you alone if you're polite enough about it. So somewhere along the way, we stopped waiting for permission to survive We just decided we would, and then we built everything else around that decision. Fear never got a vote in whether we kept going. It just gets to come along for the ride. That is not rational, I said, though even as I spoke, I heard the hollowness in my own words. Maybe not, Grace agreed, but it's worked so far. Every single time, so far. I studied her for a long moment, this small, unremarkable creature who had, through nothing more than calm refusal, unraveled certainties that had stood unquestioned across 3 centuries of my service and 40 worlds of conquest. I am going to recommend your release, I said finally. And I am going to recommend a full withdrawal of Sondrel forces from your system. Grace raised an eyebrow, the first genuine surprise I had seen from her since our first meeting. Just like that? Not just like that, I said. It has cost me everything I understood about how the universe works to reach this conclusion. But yes, just like that. She was quiet for a moment, studying me, with something that might have been sympathy, though I could not be entirely certain, given how little I truly understood about human expressions, even after months of close observation. For what it's worth, she said eventually, I don't think you're a bad person. Species, whatever you are. I think you just ran into something you weren't built to handle, and you're smart enough to know it, instead of pretending otherwise. That's more than I expected, honestly. I did not know how to respond to that, so I said nothing, and after a moment, she simply nodded, as though my silence had answered whatever question she had been asking. My recommendation for withdrawal met fierce resistance within the Directorate, exactly as I expected. High Commander DreadHFY summoned me once more, her patience clearly worn thin by months of costly failure, and a growing unease spreading through the ranks that no official report could fully capture. You are asking the Council to abandon a campaign against a pre-industrial species, she said, her voice tight with barely restrained frustration. Do you understand how this will appear across our other territories? 40 worlds watched us conquer them through fear alone. If they learn we withdrew from a world with no meaningful defense against us, what do you imagine that will do to our authority everywhere else? I understand the risk, I said, but I have watched 6 major engagements against this species, and in every single one, our overwhelming advantage in force produced no meaningful advantage in outcome. I have lost ships, soldiers, and something harder to quantify, the certainty that has held our empire together for 3 centuries. I do not believe further engagement will produce a different result. I believe it will only cost us more. And if the Council disagrees? Then the Council may replace me with a commander willing to continue losing ships in pursuit of an outcome I no longer believe is achievable, I said. But I will not lead further assaults against a world that has already shown us, repeatedly and unmistakably, that our oldest weapon no longer functions against it. DreadHFY studied me for a long moment through the transmission, and I saw, for just an instant, something flicker behind her composed expression, something that might have been the same creeping unease I had felt growing within myself for months. You believe this dread you describe is spreading, she said finally. It was not quite a question. I believe it already has, I said. I believe every soldier who has faced this species carries some version of it home with them, whether they recognize it or not. I believe the more we study humans, the more we understand them, the heavier it grows, because understanding them does not make them less unpredictable. It only makes clear how completely unpredictable they truly are. The Council deliberated for 3 days before reaching their decision, and in the end, though it cost me my former standing among certain factions of the Directorate, they granted the withdrawal. Official records would later describe the decision as a strategic reallocation of resources toward more valuable territories, a phrase I found almost comically inadequate for what had actually transpired. I gave the order myself, standing on my command deck as our fleet began its slow retreat from the Sol system, watching the small blue world shrink behind us on the view screen until it became indistinguishable from the countless other stars scattered across the black. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel defeated either, not in any way I fully understood. What I felt, more than anything, was the quiet, settled weight of something that had taken root and would not easily be removed. Dread, it seemed, did not leave simply because the source of it grew distant. It had already found a permanent home inside me, and I suspected, correctly, that it would remain there for the rest of my long life. 10 years passed before I spoke publicly about the Sol campaign, and by then, I was no longer a commander of active fleets. I had been reassigned to an advisory role within the Sondrel Military Academy, a position my superiors likely intended as a quiet retirement for an officer who had grown too cautious for their liking. I did not resent the reassignment. In truth, I welcomed it, for it gave me the opportunity to do something I considered far more important than further conquest. I stood before a class of young officers, cadets who had grown up hearing stories of our empire's 40 conquered worlds, taught from birth that fear was the great equalizer between our fleet and any species foolish enough to resist us. They looked at me with the same confidence I once carried myself, a confidence I understood now as both a strength and a vulnerability, depending on what it eventually encountered. "Commander Call," one of the cadets said, a sharp young officer named Ressa, who reminded me uncomfortably of myself at her age. "The historical records describe your withdrawal from the Sol system as a strategic decision, but there are rumors among the senior staff that something else happened there. Something the official records do not fully capture." I studied her for a long moment before answering, remembering another young face, calm and unafraid, sitting across from me in a holding cell that now felt impossibly distant. "The official records are accurate as far as they go," I said. "But they do not capture everything, because some things resist capture entirely." "What do you mean, Commander?" I moved to the front of the room and activated the display behind me, bringing up an image of the small blue world that still occupied more of my thoughts than I would ever fully admit. Earth, spinning quietly in its orbit, utterly unremarkable by every measure the universe typically used to judge significance. "Our empire," I began, "was built on a simple principle. Fear works. Show a species sufficient force, and they will recognize the wisdom of surrender." This principle held true across 40 worlds, and it held true for so long that we stopped questioning whether it might ever fail us. We assumed fear was a universal constant, as reliable as gravity, as certain as the turning of a star. I paused, letting the image of Earth linger on the screen behind me. Then we encountered a species that broke that principle without appearing to try very hard. Not because they lacked fear entirely. I want to be clear about this, because it is the part most difficult to properly explain. Humans feel fear as deeply as any species we have ever catalogued, perhaps more deeply, given how fragile their bodies and how short their lives. But fear, for them, has never been the final word on any matter. It is simply a feeling they carry alongside everything else, one voice among many, rather than the only voice that decides what happens next. Ressa frowned, clearly struggling with the concept. How is that possible? Fear exists to protect a species from danger. If they do not heed it, surely they simply die more often than species who do. "They do die," I said. "Frequently, and often needlessly, by our standards. But their deaths do not produce the surrender we expected. Each loss seems only to strengthen whatever resolve remains among the survivors, rather than weakening it. It is, from an evolutionary perspective, deeply inefficient, and yet it worked against us, every single time we tested it." I brought up the recording of Ethan Marlowe's speech, the one I had watched more times than I could count over the intervening years, and let it play for the assembled cadets. I watched their faces as they listened, watched the confusion settle over them the same way it had once settled over me. "This is the part our doctrine has never adequately addressed," I continued, once the recording ended. "We built an empire on the assumption that overwhelming force produces predictable outcomes. Humans taught us that some species do not calculate outcomes the way we expect. They simply decide, in advance, that they will continue, regardless of what the numbers suggest, and then they act accordingly, every single time, without exception." "Is this what the reports mean by dread, Commander?" Ressa asked quietly. "The condition described in the classified addendums to the Sol campaign records?" I nodded slowly. "Fear is manageable, Cadet. Because fear responds to information. Show a frightened enemy sufficient force, and their fear will guide them towards surrender, because fear is fundamentally a survival mechanism, and survival, for most species, means avoiding destruction whenever possible. Dread is different. Dread is what grows in you when you encounter something that refuses to follow that pattern, when you show overwhelming force and watch it fail to produce the expected result, again and again, until you begin to doubt not the enemy's judgment, but your own understanding of how the universe operates." I let that settle over the room for a long moment before continuing. I did not fear the humans, not in the way I had once feared other things across 3 centuries of service. I dreaded them, because every encounter deepened my uncertainty, rather than resolving it. Every battle taught me less about how to defeat them, and more about how little I actually understood the fundamental principles I had built my entire career upon. That uncertainty does not fade the way fear does. It settles into you, quiet and permanent, and it changes how you see every subsequent encounter with the universe, whether or not that encounter has anything to do with the species that first caused it. A cadet near the back of the room, quieter than Ressa, raised a tentative claw. "Commander, if this species cannot be conquered through fear, how should future officers be trained to face them? Should contact ever resume?" It was the question I had been waiting for, the reason I had requested this particular teaching assignment, rather than any other available to an officer of my standing. "They should not be trained to conquer them at all," I said. "That is the lesson our empire has been slowest to accept, and the one I consider most important to pass on to each of you, before you ever encounter a species like this yourselves. Our doctrine assumes every civilization can be measured, categorized, and eventually subdued through sufficient application of force. Humans exist as proof that this assumption, however successful it has been across 40 worlds, is not universal. Some species cannot be frightened into submission, no matter how overwhelming the force applied against them, because submission was never a variable in their understanding of themselves to begin with. Then what should we do, Commander, if we encounter something similar again?" I considered the question carefully before answering, drawing on everything I had learned across a campaign that had cost me ships, soldiers, and the certainty that had defined my entire career, but had given me something else in return, something I still struggled to fully articulate, even after a decade of reflection. "You should recognize the feeling before it consumes you," I said finally. "You should learn to notice the difference between fear, which sharpens judgment and responds to reason, and dread, which clouds judgment and grows regardless of reason. And when you feel that difference beginning to take hold, when overwhelming force fails to produce the outcome your training tells you it should, you should have the wisdom to stop, to withdraw, and to consider that perhaps you have encountered something the old doctrines were never built to handle. Pride will tell you to continue, to apply more force, to prove that the old rules still hold. Pride nearly cost me everything, before I learned to set it aside." The room remained silent for a long moment after I finished speaking, the cadets absorbing a lesson their curriculum had never fully prepared them to hear, one that ran contrary to everything our history taught them about their place in the wider universe. I dismissed the class shortly afterward, and as the cadets filed out, Ressa lingered behind, studying the frozen image of Earth still displayed on the screen behind me. "Do you think we will ever return there, Commander?" she asked. "To finish what the campaign started?" I thought of Grace Whitfield, of her calm eyes and her steady voice, of a small, stubborn world that had taught an empire spanning 40 conquered civilizations the true limits of its oldest and most reliable weapon. "I think," I said slowly, "that if we are wise, we will leave that world exactly where it is, spinning quietly on its own path, and we will carry the lesson it taught us to every other corner of the universe we still intend to explore. Fear built our empire, Ressa. But humanity taught us something fear alone could never accomplish. It taught us the difference between an enemy who can be frightened into stillness and one who simply continues, regardless of how frightened they become, until the very last breath allows them to keep going." I switched off the display, and the image of Earth faded from the screen, though it never fully faded from my thoughts, not then, and not in all the years that followed. We had conquered 40 worlds through fear. Humanity had shown us dread, and in doing so, had taught our entire empire something no previous conquest ever had, that somewhere in the vast and largely predictable universe, there existed at least one small, soft, short-lived species that refused, categorically and eternally, to be afraid in any way that mattered. And that lesson, more than any battle we fought or any ship we lost, remained the truest legacy of our first and only encounter with the people of Earth.